The sun rose slowly over the vast expanse of the plantation, casting long golden streaks across the dusty yard where the auction block stood. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, hay, and the faint scent of horses, mingling with the anxious murmurs of families and buyers alike. Among the gathered crowd, there were rows of men, women, and children, some fidgeting, some standing still with faces hardened by fear. And there, near the back, stood a boy who seemed to exist almost outside of it all, a boy no one noticed until the very end. He was chubby, round-faced, his arms thick and soft, carrying no hint of the muscular strength that buyers often sought. His clothes hung loosely on his small frame, patched in places and stained from the work he had done long before the auction even began. The boy's name, whispered quietly among the other slaves, meant little to those who had the power to decide his fate. To the buyers, he was just another body, another piece of property, another life they could purchase or ignore. They walked past him with quick glances, scanning for traits they valued, strong backs, sharp eyes, quick limbs, but in him they saw none of that. His legs were round and wobbly, his hands soft and uncalloused, and when he moved, it was with a hesitant shuffling rather than the confident stride of those deemed worthy. He had been overlooked for so long that even he had begun to internalize the world's indifference. Standing there, in the shadow of the auction stage, the boy felt the weight of all those eyes, not in admiration but in quiet judgment. The other children had been claimed hours ago, taken by men who measured their worth in physical labor. He had watched, from the edge of the yard, as friends were chosen and taken away, the sound of their frightened voices calling out to parents, to siblings, to the memories of freedom they had long forgotten. Now it was only him, shuffling slightly, feeling the dirt clump beneath his bare feet, feeling the sting of the hot morning sun on his skin. The sounds of the crowd blended into a low, relentless hum, voices calling out prices, laughter from those amused at the spectacle, murmurs from mothers whose hands shook as they clutched their children. The boy's own heart beat in a steady rhythm, one he tried to ignore but could not. He was neither fast nor strong, neither clever nor beautiful in the ways that made others desirable. He was just there. And yet, even in that invisibility, he carried a quiet awareness. A sense of the world's cruelty pressed down upon him like the relentless sun overhead. He knew that being unwanted was a strange kind of punishment, not one that left bruises or scars, but one that whispered constantly in his ear that he was less than everyone else, that he was not enough. And still, he endured. Time passed slowly on that dusty yard, measured in the shuffling of feet and the occasional sharp clink of coins exchanged. Buyers debated loudly among themselves, comparing children, bargaining over bodies as if they were mere sacks of grain. The boy watched them, and for a fleeting moment a spark of hope flickered. Perhaps someone might see him, might recognize something hidden beneath his round cheeks and hesitant eyes. But as the minutes dragged on, one by one, the other children were chosen, leaving him standing alone. The hopeful spark dimmed into a quiet, steady ache. He remembered the whispered stories of the elders, tales of those who had been overlooked and left behind, only to find themselves cast aside into lives far harsher than those chosen. He tried to steel himself against the thought, telling himself it did not matter, that his existence, small and unnoticed, was safer in its quiet obscurity. Yet, with every passing glance from the buyers, he felt the world pressing in, shaping him into someone who would never be desired, never be wanted. Around him, the atmosphere shifted. The murmur of the crowd became louder, voices raising in exclamation and surprise as a young girl, strong and clever, was claimed by a buyer. The boy watched, feeling a mix of relief and envy, relief that he was not the subject of scrutiny, envy for the attention she received. He could hear her laugh as she was lifted onto the buyer's horse, her small frame glowing with pride and fear. And he wondered if he would ever feel such acknowledgement. The auctioneer's voice cut through the haze of heat and dust, sharp and commanding, listing the remaining children one by one. He called for the boy, his words echoing against the wooden stalls and the low-lying buildings. "And last, we have a young lad. He is sturdy, well, he's a boy." The words were awkward, uncertain, as if even the auctioneer did not quite know what to say about him. The boy's stomach twisted. The crowd laughed lightly, not cruelly, but with the same indifference that had followed him all his life. They did not see a boy, only the silhouette of someone who could be passed over without consequence. The boy's eyes darted across the yard, catching fleeting glimpses of faces, some curious, some bored, some already calculating the minimal worth they might derive from his body. He felt the weight of their judgment, a crushing reminder that he was, in their eyes, nothing more than an object, unremarkable, easily ignored. His chest tightened, and he found himself holding back tears that he was certain would betray weakness. He had learned long ago that tears were a luxury not afforded to those like him. As the auction continued, he noticed the subtle shifts in the crowd. Some buyers lingering a moment too long, not out of desire, but perhaps curiosity. A few whispered to one another, pointing at his round face and hesitant posture, voices muted and carrying the same tone of indecision. The boy did not move, did not respond, only stood rooted to the ground, the dirt warm beneath his feet, the sun burning the back of his neck. He could feel himself shrinking, an instinctual desire to disappear, to blend into the earth and vanish from their sight. And yet, despite the humiliation, despite the weight of invisibility pressing down upon him, there was something resilient in the boy's posture, a quiet persistence. He did not run, he did not beg, he did not flinch. In a world that had refused him recognition, he carried himself with the subtle dignity of someone who had learned to survive by being unseen. Each breath he drew was a small act of defiance, each heartbeat a reminder that he existed, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, scorching the backs of those standing in the yard. The boy felt exhaustion seep into his limbs, a dull ache that came from standing still, from waiting, from enduring the indifferent gaze of so many strangers. Yet still, he remained, a silent testament to resilience in a place where the weak were easily discarded. He had learned to endure loneliness, to accept neglect, and to carry the quiet burden of being unwanted. In that endurance there was a strange kind of strength, one that the world could not see, could not measure, but that existed all the same, pulsating beneath the softness of his exterior. By the time the day waned and the shadows stretched long across the plantation yard, the boy Ned, untouched, unchosen. Buyers began to depart, some leaving in frustration, others simply ignoring him as they had ignored him all along. And yet, in that very moment, standing alone in the fading light, the boy felt a strange clarity. He was the one who had survived the scrutiny, who had weathered the indifference, who had endured the invisible judgment of countless eyes. He was unwanted, yes, but he was still here. And in that presence, in that quiet defiance, there was a story waiting to unfold, one that no one in the auction yard had anticipated. As the last coins clinked and the auctioneer called the event to a close, the boy remained on the edge of the crowd, overlooked yet unbroken. He felt the cool breeze sweep across his face, carrying with it the scent of the fields, the horses, and the distant river. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that being unwanted had shaped him, molded him in ways no one else could understand. It had given him patience, endurance, and a certain invisibility that might one day become his greatest asset. For now, though, he simply stood there, chubby and unnoticed, a boy who no one wanted, yet somehow, in the vastness of the plantation, held on to a quiet, unseen power that even he had yet to understand. And so the boy remained, a figure of neglect in a world that prized strength and beauty, carrying the weight of being overlooked with a dignity that only he could claim. Little did anyone know the very qualities that made him unwanted today, old in time, make him irresistible to someone whose eyes could see far beyond the surface, someone whose desire would change the course of his life in ways the auction yard could never predict. The plantation lady stood at the edge of the veranda, her eyes fixed on the auction yard below. From this distance she could see the orderly chaos of the crowd, the raised voices, the shuffling of feet, the occasional sharp laughter from those amused by the spectacle of human lives being weighed and measured. Yet her gaze lingered not on the strong, the clever, or the beautiful, but on the boy at the far end, the one everyone else seemed to ignore. She had noticed him before, always on the periphery, always overlooked, always quietly enduring the world's indifference. While others laughed at his awkward movements or turned away in disinterest, she found herself drawn to him in a way she could not name. He stood there, the sun catching the soft curve of his round cheeks, the way his hair fell slightly into his eyes, the hesitant shuffle of his feet as if he were uncertain whether the ground beneath him would support him or betray him. There was something almost imperceptible about him, a stillness that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy of the yard. It was not strength, it was not beauty, but something subtler, an invisible thread of resilience, a quiet endurance that seemed to radiate from within. She found herself watching him longer than she intended, noticing how he bore the weight of judgment with a peculiar dignity. Others saw only flesh and fat, a child too soft to work, too unremarkable to own. She saw a story yet untold, a mystery that hovered around him like a shadow. Her husband had been at the auction, a commanding presence among the buyers, calling for children with practiced precision, yet even he had overlooked the boy, passing by with a nod that dismissed him entirely. And for once, she felt something stir within her, an unfamiliar spark of attention that was neither maternal nor possessive in the ordinary sense. It was curiosity, yes, but more than curiosity, it was a desire to know what lay beneath, to understand the quiet defiance that made him stand so tall despite being unwanted. She watched him with a careful patience, careful not to reveal her fascination to anyone else, knowing that to show interest in what everyone else discarded might raise questions. The boy did not notice her at first, and perhaps that was why she found the moment so compelling. His eyes were cast downward, observing the dirt beneath his feet, tracking the shadows that shifted with the movement of people around him. He did not seek attention, nor did he expect kindness. His world was one of invisibility, where being seen was often the first step toward disappointment. And yet, as she watched, she sensed a flicker of awareness in him, a subtle tension that suggested he felt eyes upon him, even if he could not see from whom. There was an honesty in that ignorance, a purity in the way he existed without pretense, that drew her gaze ever closer. Her mind wandered as she observed him, imagining the quiet moments of his life that others never saw. How he might rise before the sun, his small frame bending beneath chores meant for stronger bodies. How he might navigate the eyes of harsh overseers, the whispers of other slaves, the silent rejection of a world that valued only what could be used, measured, or sold. She felt a strange kinship with his solitude, as though his invisibility mirrored some unspoken part of herself, some corner of her own existence that had gone unnoticed, unappreciated. As the auction progressed, her attention remained unwavering. She noticed the subtle ways he moved, the careful placement of his hands, the shifting of his weight from foot to foot, the slight tilt of his head, as if listening not to the auctioneer's words, but to some internal rhythm only he could hear. These small details, insignificant to others, spoke volumes to her. They revealed patience, awareness, and an unspoken intelligence, a kind of quiet strength that could survive in a world designed to discard him. There was something magnetic about it, something that compelled her to continue watching, even when propriety, habit, and expectation urged her to look elsewhere. Her husband moved past her, calling for one child after another, nodding and bargaining, never once noticing the boy at the edge of the yard. And in that moment she really how differently she saw the world, how differently she measured worth. While others focused on physical labor or the ability to perform, she saw the intangible, the resilience, the endurance, the quiet dignity that could not be weighed in pounds or sold in coins. She saw a spirit, fragile yet unbroken, a life overlooked yet filled with possibility. Time seemed to slow as she continued to watch. The boy shifted slightly, adjusting his posture, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, his eyes flicking toward the shadows cast by the veranda. She felt an inexplicable thrill at this small gesture, a connection born not of words but of silent recognition. He was unaware of her gaze, yet somehow she felt he belonged in a narrative she had not yet fully written, a story that might unfold in ways the auction yard could never anticipate. The crowd's attention was elsewhere, drawn to children who performed for their approval, whose smiles and strength elicited gasps or laughter. She noticed the way buyers leaned forward to examine muscular arms, nimble fingers, or sharp eyes. And she noticed, in contrast, how the boy remained untouched, overlooked, unclaimed. Her heart ached in a way she could not articulate. There was something deeply human in his rejection, a tragedy of neglect that no one else seemed to notice. Yet within that rejection, she sensed potential, a hidden depth that had not yet been recognized or exploited. She imagined what it would be like to approach to speak to him, to see if he might respond to kindness rather than indifference. But she did not move. She did not speak. She merely watched, allowing the moment to linger, savoring the quiet connection that passed between observer and observed. There was a power in silence, she realized, a subtle authority in being present without imposing. And as she continued to watch, she began to understand that desire was not always immediate or obvious. It could simmer, it could grow, it could wait patiently until the right moment revealed itself. The boy shifted again, this time glancing momentarily toward the veranda. Though he could not see her, there was a sense of awareness, a subtle tension, as though he sensed something unknown, something intangible hovering in the air. She felt a thrill at this recognition, a shiver of anticipation at the idea that he might one day understand that he was seen, that he was noticed, that someone had cared enough to watch silently as he endured the indifference of a cruel world. As the day wore on, the boy remained standing, and she remained watching. The auction ended for others, children were claimed, voices faded, and yet he stayed, a solitary figure amidst the departure of others. She realized that this endurance, this ability to remain unshaken in the face of neglect, was rare. Most would have broken under the weight of constant rejection. Most would have fled or cowered or cried out. But he did none of these things. He simply stood, quietly defiant, carrying the invisible burden of being unwanted with a dignity that could not be taken, sold, or measured. Her fascination deepened, a mixture of curiosity, empathy, and something more complex, something that bordered on desire. She did not understand it fully, could not name it, but she felt drawn to him in ways that were both unsettling and compelling. He was no longer just a boy she observed from afar. He was a presence, a force, a character in a story she could not yet tell. The quiet intensity of his existence, the resilience hidden beneath his chubby frame, made him more interesting than the strong, clever, or beautiful children who had been claimed long before. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, she knew that the boy had entered her consciousness in a way no one else had. She felt a connection that required no words, no physical touch, no acknowledgement from him. It was a silent understanding, a recognition of something intangible yet undeniable. And in that silent observation, a seed was planted, a seed of curiosity, of desire, of a story that was yet to unfold. She turned away from the veranda only reluctantly, her eyes stealing one last glance at the boy as the yard emptied. He remained, a solitary figure bathed in the fading light, unclaimed yet unbroken, unwanted yet quietly enduring. And she knew, without fully understanding why, that he had changed something within her. She did not yet know what the future held. I did not yet know how or when their paths would cross, but she knew that she would remember this boy, the one no one wanted, the one overlooked by all, the one who stood with quiet dignity at the edge of the world, waiting for something she could not yet name. In the stillness of that moment, she felt the stirrings of an emotion she had not anticipated, a fascination that was patient, deliberate, and persistent. It was not the shallow desire of whim or impulse, but something deeper, something that recognized the unseen, the overlooked, the quietly resilient. And as night fell over the plantation, she carried the image of the boy with her, etched into her mind with a clarity that only those who truly notice can understand. He had captured her attention in silence, and in that silence a story had begun to take shape, one that neither of them could yet fully comprehend. The sun had begun its descent, casting a warm amber glow across the plantation, but the boy remained rooted in the auction yard, his small frame bathed in the fading light. The crowd had thinned, leaving only a few buyers still lingering, their attention shifting elsewhere, their interest in him still non-existent. For hours he had been overlooked, ignored, unseen, and in that invisibility he had found a peculiar sort of safety. The shadows of the tall wooden stalls and the long veranda had become familiar companions, stretching long across the yard, as if the world itself were tucking him into a quiet corner. Yet, that safety, fragile and unspoken, was about to be disrupted in a way he could never have imagined. She had remained on the veranda, watching silently as the auction concluded. The day had been long, and most buyers had left with children deemed useful or beautiful, leaving the boy behind. But she did not leave. Instead, she observed the soft curves of his body, the hesitant movements of his limbs, the quiet endurance in his posture. There was something compelling about his stillness, something that demanded recognition in a world that had denied him it. She felt the stirrings of a decision, one that had taken root in her mind, growing quietly over hours of observation. This boy, unwanted by all, would not leave the plantation. Not yet, not by chance. Her footsteps were light as she descended the veranda stairs, the hem of her dress whispering against the polished wood. She did not call to him. She did not summon him with words. Instead, she approached with an air of authority that was at once deliberate and unyielding, a presence he could not ignore even if he wished to. The boy, sensing movement but unable to place its source, raised his head slowly. His eyes met hers briefly, confusion flickering across his round face. She did not smile, did not speak. She simply looked, and in that look was a command he could not articulate, a signal that his fate had changed. He shuffled forward instinctively, uncertainty in every step. He had learned to read the world through sight, through the slightest shifts in gaze or tone, but nothing had prepared him for this. No one had ever watched him like this before, not with attention, not with intent, not with the quiet insistence that she carried with her. There was no malice, no anger, no negotiation in her eyes, only a steady, deliberate focus that unsettled him even as it drew him closer. It was unlike anything he had experienced, and he felt the strange, fluttering mix of fear and curiosity settle in his chest. Without a word, she reached out and gestured toward the house. The boy hesitated, glancing briefly toward the empty auction yard, then back at her. The fading sunlight cast long shadows over his soft features, accentuating the uncertainty and vulnerability in his posture. She did not rush him, did not speak. She simply waited, allowing the tension to stretch between them like a taut string ready to snap. Slowly, he began to follow, each step hesitant but obedient, drawn by a force he could not yet name. The veranda led into a wide hall, the floor polished to a shine, reflecting the waning light. The air inside was cooler, the faint scent of lavender and polished wood filling his senses, so different from the dust and sweat of the auction yard. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a mixture of awe and fear, as the house seemed to envelop him in its unfamiliar grandeur. His small hands brushed against the smooth wooden railing, and he wondered what awaited him inside. For hours he had imagined being ignored, being left behind. And yet, now that he was noticed, now that he was called forward, he felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon him, heavier than the gaze of any buyer. She led him through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him, judging him even as the woman's steady presence beside him offered a strange reassurance. He felt himself shrinking, wishing for invisibility once more, yet compelled to continue. There was no one to speak for him here, no friend to guide him, no ally among the servants who moved silently in the background. He was alone, yet not entirely alone. Her presence was constant, a silent assertion that he belonged here, though he had never asked to. In a room at the far end of the house, she stopped. The boy's heart pounded, echoing loudly in his chest, his hands trembling slightly. He did not understand why he had been brought here, why she had chosen him of all the children, of all the bodies. of all the lives that had passed through the auction yard that day. He glanced around the room, noting the soft rugs, the high ceiling, the heavy curtains that filtered the light into a warm, golden haze. It was a room of comfort, a room he had never known, a place that seemed at once inviting and forbidding, and in that space he became acutely aware of how small and fragile he seemed, how unprepared he was for the attention now being directed solely at him. She spoke then, her voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of command and certainty. "You will stay here," she said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as an assertion of fact. The boy swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He had spent his life obeying commands, yet this was different. This was not the hurried, harsh instructions of overseers or the fleeting whims of buyers. This was deliberate, thoughtful, a choice made by someone who had considered him and found him suitable. The word did not make sense in his mind, and yet he understood it. He understood that his life had shifted, irrevocably, in this single moment. For a long time, he stood silently, absorbing the enormity of the situation. His eyes wandered to the corners of the room, to the polished furniture, the neatly stacked books, the delicate ornaments that seemed fragile, like the life he had once known but never possessed. He thought of the auction yard, the relentless scrutiny, the rejection by those who had deemed him unworthy. And yet here, in this room, in the presence of the woman who had watched him in silence, he felt a new and unfamiliar sense of attention, a focus that was both unsettling and intriguing. She watched him closely, noting the subtle movements, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. She did not speak further, did not offer comfort or explanation. She simply observed, allowing him to adjust to the new reality, to confront the quiet terror and anxiety that came with being chosen after so long being ignored. It was a test, in a sense, a way to see how he would respond when the world's indifference was replaced by deliberate attention, when invisibility was exchanged for scrutiny, when neglect was replaced by expectation. Hours seemed to pass in that room, though perhaps it was only minutes. The boy's mind raced, a swirl of fear, confusion, and curiosity. He thought of the auction yard, the shouting, the laughter, the disinterest, and realized how different this was. Here, no one bargained for him, no one mocked him, no one treated him as a commodity to be weighed and measured. Instead, there was observation, deliberate and intentional, and a sense that his very presence mattered, that he had been selected not because of his strength or skill, but for reasons he could not yet comprehend. As the evening deepened, the shadows in the room lengthened, stretching across the polished floor and creeping up the walls. The boy felt the weight of those shadows pressing against him, and with them came the understanding that his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a boy ignored by the world. He was now a boy noticed, chosen, and observed. And with that notice came a responsibility he could not yet name, a silent expectation that he would rise to the moment, even if he did not yet understand what it required. The woman finally spoke again, her voice soft this time, almost a whisper, yet carrying the same authority. "Why, as before? You will live here," she said, repeating the earlier command in words that seemed to echo through the room. "And you will obey, not out of fear, but because it is expected of you." The boy nodded, though his understanding was incomplete. Fear and curiosity tangled within him, a knot he could not untangle, and yet he felt the first stirrings of trust, or at least a recognition that the path before him was not entirely cruel. That night, as he lay on a simple bed in the unfamiliar room, he thought of the auction yard, of the long hours of being ignored, of the ache of invisibility that had haunted him for so long. And yet, even amidst the uncertainty and fear, there was a flicker of something new, possibility. He did not know what the future held, did not know why he had been chosen, did not know what the woman's intentions were, but he knew, deep within, that his life had changed. The shadows he had called friends for so long would no longer be his only companions, and though he was terrified, though the unknown pressed against him like the night itself, He could not help but feel a quiet anticipation for what was to come. For the first time in his life, being noticed did not bring only fear. It brought attention, and with attention came possibility, however fragile, however uncertain. He had been taken from the shadows, pulled into a space of scrutiny and care, and though the rules were unclear, the moment carried with it a sense of inevitability. He was no longer just a boy no one wanted. He was a boy chosen, observed, and, in ways he did not yet understand, desired. And that knowledge, as terrifying as it was, held the first seeds of power, of change, of a story yet to be told. The days that followed were quiet at first, almost deceptively so. The boy found himself moving through the plantation house with a strange mixture of awe and fear. Each corner, each corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the faint scent of polished wood, lavender, and lingering candle wax. Servants moved around silently, their eyes downcast, whispering only when necessary, and the boy learned quickly to step lightly, to observe without drawing attention. Yet even in this controlled environment, he could feel her presence at all times, the woman who had chosen him, who had pulled him from the shadows of the auction yard. She did not hover or command overtly, but her attention was constant, almost tangible, like a weight pressing gently on him from every angle. She watched him, not as a mere overseer would, not as a buyer might, but with a focus that seemed to pierce through the soft flesh, through the hesitancy, through the uncertainty that clung to him. In her gaze he felt both evaluation and something more elusive, a fascination that unsettled him even as it intrigued him. It was not the scrutiny of labor he had known, nor the indifference of those who had ignored him all his life. This attention carried with it expectation, subtle and unspoken, and he began to sense that his value was measured not by strength or skill, but by something deeper, something invisible. The first moments of their interaction were hesitant, tentative, like a dance neither of them fully understood. She spoke rarely, choosing her words with deliberate care, testing the boy's reactions, measuring the way he responded to calm authority and subtle insistence. He learned quickly that obedience alone was not sufficient. She wanted attention, awareness, subtle engagement, a recognition of the roles they were beginning to play. It was a game of power, though she did not call it that, and he did not yet understand the rules. But the tension was palpable, a silent thread binding them together, one that neither dared to name. He began to notice the way she moved in the room, graceful, deliberate, commanding without the need for harsh words. Every gesture carried intention, every glance seemed to weigh him, assess him, draw him into her orbit. She noticed small things as well, the way his shoulders tensed when she approached, the slight quickening of his breath, the way his gaze flickered to hers before darting away. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but she saw it all, and in that seeing she began to mold him, shape him, draw him into the rhythm of her will. Days turned into weeks, and the boy began to adapt to this new life, though it was nothing like the life he had known. In the auction yard, invisibility had been a shield, a quiet protection from the harsh judgment of others. Here, visibility was demanded, not with violence, but with expectation. Every movement, every glance, every hesitation was noted, and the boy learned that tension could be both frightening and intoxicating. He could not ignore her presence, could not escape the feeling that she was always observing, always guiding, always testing. And slowly, he realized that his survival depended not just on obedience, but on understanding her desires, on reading the subtle cues she offered, on anticipating what she wanted before she spoke. There were moments when her fascination with him became almost tangible, a current that ran through the room whenever they were near each other. She would linger near him, her eyes tracing the curve of his soft cheeks, the roundness of his frame, the hesitant movements that had once marked him as unremarkable. It was not physical strength she sought, nor skill, nor even beauty in the conventional sense. It was something quieter, more elusive. She was drawn to the quiet resilience he had developed in the shadows, the patience that had allowed him to endure neglect, the subtle intelligence hidden beneath his innocence. And he, in turn, began to sense that this attention carried with it power, an influence that could shape his life in ways he had never imagined. The interplay between them became a silent rhythm, a negotiation of control and desire that neither named. She did not force him, did not issue commands in anger, but every look, every word, every pause carried expectation. He learned to anticipate her movements, to interpret her silence, to read the faintest shift in expression. In doing so, he discovered a strange form of agency, the ability to respond in ways that pleased her, to navigate her expectations without direct instruction. It was a subtle power, one born of observation and intuition, and it drew him deeper into her orbit. At times he felt overwhelmed by the intensity of her attention. The quiet fixation of her gaze made him acutely aware of his own body, of the soft curves and hesitations that had once marked him as unworthy. He felt self-conscious in ways he had never imagined, his mind torn between fear and fascination, between the desire to shrink away and the instinct to meet her eyes with awareness. Every interaction carried weight, every gesture was meaningful, and he began to understand that being wanted was not simple or safe. It was a responsibility, a test, a negotiation of wills. She too was changed by the boy's presence. The fascination she felt was not merely physical or aesthetic, it was psychological, a challenge to her understanding of control and influence. He was soft, unremarkable by conventional standards, yet he held a quiet power over her attention, a subtle dominance in his vulnerability that drew her in. She found herself observing him for hours, noting the small ways he adapted, the subtle resilience that marked him as different from the children she had seen purchased before. In his stillness, in his endurance, she found something she had not anticipated, a force that required patience, attention, and recognition. The dynamics between them shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly. She began to test boundaries, not with cruelty, but with deliberate precision. She would instruct him to perform tasks with a calm insistence, observing not only the results but the subtle cues in his expression, the hesitation in his movements, the small gestures of awareness that revealed how he was processing her expectations. He responded, slowly at first, unsure of what was required, then with increasing confidence as he learned to navigate her silent commands. In doing so, he discovered a sense of control within himself, the ability to influence her perception, to meet her expectations without losing his own sense of self. Evenings were the most intense. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the plantation house, she would stand near the boy, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, letting the tension between them simmer in the quiet light. He could feel her focus, an invisible weight pressing against him, testing him, drawing him closer. His mind raced with questions. What did she want? Why him? What did this attention mean? And yet beneath the fear and uncertainty there was a thrill, a sense of anticipation, a recognition that he was no longer invisible, that his life had been pulled from the shadows into a space where attention, fascination, and subtle desire intersected. As days turned into weeks, the interplay of desire and control became a rhythm neither could lie articulate. She noticed how he responded to subtle cues, how his awareness sharpened, how his movements became more deliberate. He noticed how her gaze lingered, how her voice carried intention even in casual conversation, how the room seemed to bend around her presence. In this silent dialogue, a power dynamic emerged, one that was fluid, shifting, and profoundly compelling. It was a dance of control and submission, observation and anticipation, desire and restraint, and both were learning its steps without instruction. The boy began to understand that being wanted came with its own dangers. Attention could be a weapon as easily as a gift. Every glance, every word, every small act of recognition carried weight. He could not ignore it, could not misstep without consequence. And yet, he discovered a strange exhilaration in this vulnerability, a thrill in the knowledge that his presence could command interest, shape perception, and hold influence even within the confines of a world that had long dismissed him. She, for her part, began to see the boy not just as a subject of fascination, but as a participant in a subtle negotiation of wills. His awareness, his responsiveness, his quiet intelligence made him more than a passive object. He was a partner in the silent game of power, a counterpart whose reactions could guide her choices as much as she guided his. In observing him, shaping him, testing him, she found herself drawn into a psychological engagement that was intense, consuming, and profoundly intimate, even in its restraint. And so the days unfolded, a careful, deliberate tension building between them. Desire was not spoken aloud, control was not wielded with force. Yet in every glance, every pause, every subtle gesture, a silent understanding grew. The boy learned to navigate the space between obedience and intuition, awareness and action. She learned to read the nuances of his responses, to anticipate his thoughts, to shape the rhythm of their interactions with precision. In this quiet, unspoken dance, power and desire intertwined, creating a dynamic that neither fully understood but both were drawn inexorably toward. By the end of the weeks, the boy had changed. He moved through the house with a newfound awareness, a confidence that had not existed before. He had learned the subtle rules of attention and response, the delicate balance between submission and agency, fear and anticipation. And she had changed too. Her fascination deepened, her curiosity sharpened, her desire tempered by the awareness of the quiet power he now held over her perception. Together they existed in a space suspended between control and surrender, attention and invisibility, desire and restraint, a space that neither could leave and neither would willingly abandon. In this delicate equilibrium, the boy discovered the strange and intoxicating reality of being wanted. It was not simple, it was not safe, it carried with it responsibility, danger and uncertainty. Yet it also offered something he had never known: recognition, presence, the sense that his existence mattered, that he could influence, respond, and shape the attention of another. And she, in turn, discovered the allure of the overlooked, the fascination of resilience, and the quiet thrill of commanding attention from someone who had once been invisible to the world. The boy had changed. The soft, hesitant figure who had once been overlooked at the auction yard now moved through the plantation house with cautious awareness, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. He had learned the rules of attention, the subtle give and take between the woman who had chosen him and the life he had not yet fully understood. Yet the more he adapted, the more he realized that being wanted was not merely a blessing, it was a weight, heavy and unyielding, pressing upon him in ways he could not yet name. At first, the attention had been strange, almost intoxicating, to be observed, to be acknowledged, to exist in a space where someone cared enough to watch him. These were sensations he had never known. In the auction yard, invisibility had been his shield, the quiet corner where he could survive unnoticed. Here he was visible, always visible, and the knowledge that someone sought him, that someone focused on him so intently, filled him with both pride and fear. He had never understood that recognition could carry such cost. The woman's fascination with him was constant. Her eyes followed him in every room, her presence lingering in the corners even when she did not speak. He had learned to read her subtle cues, the tilt of her head, the softening of her gaze, the faint inflection in her voice. Each movement carried expectation, each glance carried judgment, and each silence carried its own weight. He began to understand that her desire was not a fleeting whim but a deliberate, persistent force, one that shaped his every action. It was a strange power, this being wanted, and it demanded compliance, attention, and understanding that went far beyond simple obedience. Yet with attention came pressure. He could no longer act without consideration, could no longer move without anticipation. The small mistakes he had once been able to hide in the shadows now became visible, magnified under the scrutiny of her gaze. A fumbled step, a hesitant glance, a misread cue, all could draw disapproval, subtle though it might be, and he felt each one like a sharp weight pressing into his chest. Being wanted, he realized, was not freedom. It was a responsibility, one that demanded constant awareness, constant vigilance, and a careful navigation of invisible boundaries. The boy began to notice the subtle shifts in his own thoughts and emotions. He found himself thinking about her before she entered a room, predicting her expectations, adjusting his posture, his expressions, even the tone of his voice. It was not conscious at first, but over time it became instinctive, a reflex born of survival and necessity. He felt the strange thrill of mastering these subtleties, of gaining some control over the dynamic that had once seemed entirely beyond him. Yet it was a delicate balance. Too little awareness, and he would falter; too much, and he would risk losing himself entirely in her perception of him. The woman, for her part, deepened her scrutiny. She began to test his patience, his understanding, and his composure in ways that were subtle but undeniable. She would place him in situations that demanded judgment, requiring him to act without clear instruction, to anticipate her desires and navigate the unspoken rules of their interactions. Each challenge was a test of his resilience, a measure of how he could balance the growing power she exerted with his own emerging agency. And as he met these tests, she watched with quiet satisfaction, noting every nuance, every flicker of understanding, every hesitant success. There were moments of intensity that left him breathless with anticipation and fear. When she entered a room, the very air seemed to shift, charged with expectation. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, assessing, evaluating, drawing him into the rhythm of her will. It was as if every heartbeat, every movement, every glance mattered, and in those moments he realized that his life had become a negotiation of attention and power. Being wanted was not simply to be cherished or observed, it was to be scrutinized, to be measured, to be molded according to someone else's will while trying to retain a sense of self. The emotional toll of this dynamic became apparent over time. He felt the subtle strain of constant awareness pressing against his mind, the quiet exhaustion of performing under a gaze that never wavered. Even when she was not present, he could feel her influence lingering in the room, guiding his movements, shaping his behavior. Sleep came fitfully, dreams haunted by imagined mistakes, by imagined disapproval, by the tension between his desire to please and the instinct to retreat. Yet in this exhaustion there was growth. He learned resilience, adaptability, and the profound understanding that power could be both external and internal, imposed and claimed, demanded and negotiated. One evening, as the sun set and long shadows stretched across the polished floors, the woman approached him quietly. The room was still, the servants gone, and for a moment the boy felt the full weight of being wanted. Her gaze fell on him, steady and deliberate, and he felt a surge of awareness ripple through him. In that gaze there was no anger, no malice, no whimsy, only focus, expectation, and desire. It was an intense, consuming presence, and he understood fully, in a way he never had before, what it meant to be the object of such attention. He realized in that moment that being wanted was not simple. It was complex, layered, and fraught with risk. To be desired was to be seen fully, completely, without the protective veil of invisibility that had once kept him safe. Every action, every glance, every hesitation could be interpreted, could carry consequence, could alter the way he was perceived. He understood that he had gained attention, but at a cost, the constant awareness that his life was no longer solely his own, that it was entwined with the expectations, desires, and fascination of another. Yet despite the fear, despite the pressure, there was a thrill in this dynamic. He discovered that his actions could influence her perception, that his awareness and subtle responses could shape the environment around him. He was no longer merely a passive subject, he was a participant, an active force in the silent game of attention and control. This newfound agency gave him a strange confidence, even as it reminded him of the precariousness of his position. The power of being wanted was double-edged. It elevated him, yet demanded vigilance, intelligence, and restraint. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their interactions solidified into a delicate equilibrium. He learned the subtleties of anticipation, the small cues that indicated approval or disapproval, the ways to Vigate silence, gaze, and proximity. She, in turn, refined her understanding of him, noting his growth, his awareness, his increasing subtle control over their dynamic. Together they existed in a suspended space, a web of attention, desire, and power that neither fully understood but both were compelled to navigate. The boy began to see the cost more clearly when moments of vulnerability emerged. A mistake, a misstep, a lapse in attention. These moments, though small, carried emotional weight. The scrutiny did not always manifest as anger. Sometimes it was disappointment, sometimes quiet observation, but it was always a reminder that being wanted was not without consequence. In the quiet aftermath of such moments, he would retreat internally, assessing his actions, learning from his missteps, and preparing for the next interaction. The cost of attention, he realized, was a lifelong awareness, a constant balancing of self and expectation. Yet there were rewards too, subtle but profound. Being wanted gave him validation, recognition, and a sense of significance he had never known. The quiet fascination she directed toward him confirmed that he mattered, that his existence had value, that he could influence the world around him in ways previously unimaginable. He began to understand that attention, even when demanding, could be empowering if navigated wisely. The tension between fear and desire, expectation and agency became a driving force in his development, shaping him into someone more perceptive, more adaptable, and more aware of the currents of human behavior. As the months passed, the boy grew not only in awareness but in understanding of the complex interplay of desire and control. He realized that to be wanted was both gift and burden, reward and responsibility. The attention he received could not be taken lightly, yet it also offered him tools to navigate a world that had once rejected him. In this delicate balance, he discovered resilience, intelligence, and the subtle power of understanding human psychology. He understood the cost of being wanted, but he also understood its potential. And so, the boy who had once been overlooked, ignored, and invisible became a figure shaped by both fear and fascination, desire and control, attention and agency. He had been chosen, observed, and desired, and in that experience he had learned a profound truth, that being wanted is never simple, never without consequence, but in the careful navigation of its demands lies the opportunity for growth, influence, and self-discovery. The cost of being wanted was high, but the rewards were equally profound, and in this balance his story continued to unfold, a narrative of resilience, awareness, and the subtle, complex power of human desire.